Mrs. Bennet said. "You must leave that box alone. It is not ours to unburden." Margot Harper shut the depot doors and checked the latch twice. She had a list of errands and one last donation run to finish, and she meant to keep the promise. She came to return other people's things, not to carry their secrets. That was the job she had agreed to. She took pride in small returns. Thomas Aldridge was 82, and still waiting for a forgiveness no one had offered. His name sat at the foot of the letter like a verdict. She eased the lid and felt a small tightness, as if a hinge had held its breath. Inside were 3 medals, dulled by time, a folded letter, an unstamped envelope, and a photograph creased at a soldier's shoulder. Margot read the first line aloud, because some sentences should not be private. I had to choose between them, and my hands have not forgiven me. The words falling plain and heavy. A date followed, a riverside night in 1944, and the neat signature, Thomas Aldridge. The name made the depot feel like something that owed a debt. She placed the letter on the medals, as if marking a grave. A pale slip beneath the coins rattled, and on it someone had penciled a single word. "Thank you." And it changed the shape of the find. Margot thought of the ledger on the high shelf, the thin book that kept names from drifting. She fetched it because names were how you return things, and she scanned until an entry matched. Thomas Aldridge, Room 5, Cobbler, repairs done quietly, neat ink that smelled of steady hands. The entry read like work and retreat, a man who fixed leather and hid his life in stitches. She copied the address onto a scrap and folded it into her palm. Leaving the box behind felt wrong. Taking it felt like answering a summons. And Margot had never been one to ignore a summons. The box felt like a summons she could not ignore. She slid the unstamped envelope into her pocket as if carrying an accusation. And she kept the photograph close, because faces make memory harder to forget. The objects weighed more when they became obligations. A volunteer called from the doorway, about keys and closing time, and Mrs. Bennet's warning hung in the air. Margot felt the choice press at the back of her throat, the easy path or the right one. On the short walk across the lane, she practiced what she would say. Her plan was small and practical, to return the medals and to ask one question. Who did you mean when you wrote them? The question sat warm and sharp in her pocket and would not leave until it had an answer. She stood at the boarding house door and smoothed her skirt. Because a name spoken by a living mouth can open things kept closed for decades. She rang twice and waited, hands folded over the box like a guard. A footstep came, and she braced for whatever the door would offer. Mrs. Bennet said, "You must leave that box alone. It is not ours to unburden." Margot walked the lane with the box like a parcel of someone else's grief. She rehearsed her line, simple and practical. Return the medals, ask who you meant, and go. The boarding house smelled of old leather and newspaper. A hand-painted sign said Room 5, Cobbler, and a bell hung crooked by the door. She rang twice and waited. The door opened a fraction, a face shadowed and slow, an old man with nails stained by glue and a coat that had seen too many winters. Thomas Aldridge was 82, and he looked as if the years had folded him into the work of his hands. He took one look at the box and his shoulders slumped, like a man closing a shop for the last time. Margot said who she was and where she came from. She set the box on his doorstep without drama. He did not invite her in. He took the lid and peered inside. For a moment he held the letter like a hot coal and his jaw went tight. Then he said, "That box should have burned with the rest." Margot did not answer with words. She stepped forward and put a hand on the box. Her touch was small, deliberate. Thomas watched her as if measuring whether she would take the fire for him. He moved to the stove, the kind with a small iron door, used to heat a single room. His fingers trembled as he eased the letter toward the flame, but he stopped with the paper only singed at the corner. He said, "Someone must remember." The voice was thin and almost ashamed. Margot heard the apology behind the words. She asked why he had kept it. He shrugged. Then with a slow, flat sound, said, "Because I could not let it go into the dark." His eyes fell to a photograph she had not yet seen. Margot gently lifted the picture from the box. It was not a man in uniform alone. A child's arm looped a small hand into an adult's sleeve. Mud on boots, a cheek smudged, a smile that refused to be erased. The detail hit her like cold water. This was not only a soldier's memory. This was a life saved. She felt the floor shift under the simple fact. Thomas put the paper back down and folded his hands as if they were tools he refused to use for anything else. He told her to leave, but his eyes stayed on the letter. Margot did not go. She said, "I have questions." He closed the stove and sat, silent, as if the room itself were waiting for permission to speak. He said, "There is more than one story about that night." He would not say which was true. The refusal closed the space between them and opened a new ache for answers. Margot stayed, the box between them, and the house seemed to listen. She promised nothing, only that she would not leave until she understood one truth. Margot sat down opposite him and set the letter between their hands. She did not speak, because reading was its own summons. She unfolded the page again and began to read, steady and plain. The words were short sentences, lists of nights and names and choices. "I had to choose between them," the letter said, "and my hands have not forgiven me." The line settled like a stone. Thomas closed his eyes as if the sound of the words could press his years back into paper. He whispered, "He called my name." Margot read on. She read the part about the river, the call to hold the line, the shout for David Haynes to keep position. She read the line where a woman dragged a child, and the boat lurched. Thomas stood and walked to the window, as if footsteps could unmake the past. His hands fumbled at the sill, and then he said, "I went for the child." The admission was simple, and it broke something small and contained. He said, "I could not watch a child drown while men shouted." Margot let that sit, and then read the next breath of the letter, where the light was described as cutting, and someone went missing. The name David Haynes appeared again, and the space between the lines felt like a ledger closing. Thomas said, "David was my mate. I knew his laugh, I knew his watch. I turned and he was gone in the fire." Margot folded the photograph and held it so that the child's face looked up at both of them. She said, "Evelyn Haynes works at the center. She brings sewing kits and smiles on Tuesdays." The name slid between them and changed the claim of the past. Thomas's mouth opened and closed, like a man finding an old tool. He said, "Haynes pulled a boy to the boat, and then he stayed. He did not leave. He called my name, and I looked away to the child." A silence laid across the room. Thomas's breath hitched, and then he let out a sound that might have been a plea. He said, "I thought I was a coward. I carried that like a stone." Margot reached out and put her hand near his, not forcing but offering a commonplace contact. She said, "Someone lived. Thomas, someone grew and raised a family because of that choice." He looked at her and for a long moment did not know how to read forgiveness. He said, "I have lived with the weight. No one ever said it was forgiven." Margot closed the letter and slid it toward him. She said, "You will not carry it alone any longer." That was a promise, not a pardon. Thomas let the paper lie on his knees, and the room felt like it had room enough to breathe. He said, "Tell me if they ever knew my name." He was asking the simplest thing. Margot stood, steadier than she felt, and answered, "I will find out." The vow left the table and the past with new motion today. She left Thomas with the letter and walked back into the town with the purpose that felt like a small knife. Her steps were measured because questions can break things if thrown without care. At the Veterans Archive, she signed the visitor's book with a hand that did not tremble. The clerk looked up from a pile of folders and said, "Names up there are older than our patients." Margot asked for the Haynes file, and the clerk hesitated, then fetched a brown folder tied with string. The folder smelled of dust and printer ink and the history of things people thought they had closed. She opened the folder on a metal table and found service numbers and a scroll that read, "Missing, presumed dead." The words were bureaucratic and cold, and they changed the way she held the letter. There were reports folded inside, statements clipped like small flags. One note, handwritten and brittle, caught her eye because the script stopped and then began again in a different hand. Margot read the short line aloud because some sentences belonged to listening. "If you found the child, you chose right," it said, and the ink had bled at the corner as if from a wet thumb. Her throat closed at the thought of a soldier writing forgiveness and never posting it. She tucked the note into her pocket and felt its small weight like a coin in her palm. She copied names and dates onto a scrap and left the archive with the speed of someone carrying a map. The next stop was a small house on a lane Margot had walked past a dozen times and never noticed. The woman who opened the door wore a cardigan patched at the elbow and a face that knew how to keep a secret. Margot said she came from the center, and she had a question about a note that said thank you. The woman's hands paused over the kettle, and then she nodded as if answering a small call. She said, "My brother never spoke of that night, but he kept a story." And then she closed the door to lead Margot inside. Tea was poured in good cups, and the woman gave her name as Anne. Margot kept the letters folded on the table and watched Anne's face for a trace the photograph might wake. Anne said, "My brother used to say a stranger pulled him from the water and then left." She lifted a photo from a shelf and showed a child whose smile had outlived its mud. Margot felt the room pivot on the sight. Margot placed the photograph between the letters, and the woman sighed a small breath that carried a lifetime. She said, "We never met him, but we left a note in a box once, because some thanks had nowhere to go." Margot told Anne about Thomas and the letter and the ledger entry. Anne's eyes moved like a compass, finding north. And then she said, "Bring him to the remembrance. Bring him, and do not tell him who asked." The instruction felt like a soft order, and it made Margot think of courage as something that could be arranged. She promised the woman she would come, and she folded the papers back into their tidy order. On the walk home, Margot rehearsed a plan that was both small and precise, an invitation without a name attached. The open question pushed forward, who else remembers? And would a single thank you be enough to bridge 80 years? The remembrance hall smelled of polished wood, seats filled with people who wore their years like medals and small habits. Margot led Thomas through a side door and set the box on a chair. He stayed back while she found the woman who had once written thank you. Anne stood and read of a boy pulled from the river, and of a stranger who did not seek reward. Her words were plain and held a weight that did not need drama. Thomas kept his hands folded like a man with tools he never used for praise. Margot felt the worry in him as if it were an item she could hold. Anne read the unsent line again, the forgiveness that had waited on paper. She spoke slowly, and the room listened because silence had earned a hearing. A murmur moved through the rows and then died away. Margot felt the box lighten in her hands, like a promise being returned. Anne said the name, Thomas Aldridge, and the hall shifted. The sound made him visible in a way time had not managed. Thomas stood and walked forward with a small certainty, the kind that comes from doing what conscience demands. He did not look for praise, he only faced what had been left. A woman rose and came down the aisle to him. Her hands were steady, and she moved as if memory guided each step. She placed her palm on his sleeve and did not speak at first. She said, "Thank you," and the two words closed a long account. Thomas's eyes filled, and the sound he made was a soft surrender. People began to whisper names and stories, small connections that threaded the past to the present. Margot watched faces lean in, and she felt that the town itself was remembering. Margot took a medal and pinned it on his coat. She did it without flourish. The act was a quiet recognition, and it landed true. Thomas pressed the medal as if to secure a shape to himself. He whispered, "He forgave me first." And the confession came out like a secret given back. After the gathering, Margot led Thomas to a small room and placed a folded scrap on the table. She said, "We found this in the files, a note David wrote but never posted." He opened it with fingers that trembled and read, "Tell the boy I lived long enough to forgive." The sentence did a blunt, honest thing. It absolved a man without ceremony. Thomas let out a short laugh that sounded like surprise, and then he cried, the motion small and real. Margot sat with him while he folded the letter and held the photograph close. On the walk back, she shelved the empty box and wrote a new label, the letters careful and deliberate. Thomas Aldridge, For the River, 1944. The ledger would keep the name now, and the town had placed a small remembering where there had been none. Margot felt that was enough, and the feeling sat with her like a steady stone. Thomas carried his stone for 80 years because no one had ever told him it was all right to set it down. That's the cruelty of guilt, isn't it? It convinces us we're beyond forgiveness, that our worst moment defines us entirely. But Margot showed us something else, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply ask the question, what if I got it wrong about myself, if this story moved you? I'd be grateful if you'd share it, not for the algorithm, but because someone in your life might be carrying their own river, their own impossible choice, and they need to hear that grace still exists. And perhaps take a moment to consider, what would you do if you found that box? Would you leave it shut, or would you risk opening it? Thank you for listening. Until next time, be kind to yourselves.